We're picking up on Chapter 10 of The Ultimate Evil, an investigation of America's most dangerous satanic cult by Maury. Fix this a little bit. Yeah, there we go. On Wednesday morning, December 28th, Jim Midigar and I linked up near the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which unites the borough of Staten Island and South Shore of Brooklyn, and veered east on the Belt Parkway toward Coney Island. As we passed under the footbridge crossed by Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante that fatal night 5 months earlier, Midigar remarked that someone had hung a crucifix on the light pole the couple parked beneath. Someone also sent a letter to the 60th Precinct that week before. I answered. It warned of an attack on Coney Island or Seagate. It was taken seriously and diverted some attention from this spot. That's slick planning if it's connected, Jim said. Maybe we'll find out before this is over. A few miles to the east, we pulled off the highway and stopped at a local deli where Midigar picked up 8 containers of coffee and an assortment of pastries. I was a cop, remember? The last guy in always picks up the coffee and rolls. I wanted to ask how someone knew he would be the last to arrive for duty, but I let it go. Once inside 10th Homicide, which was located on the 2nd floor of the 60th Precinct, we were greeted by Sergeant Bill Gardella, the young supervisor who participated in Berkowitz's arrest. I took a liking to Gardella, finding him perceptive and intelligent. We were then joined by Lieutenant Robert Kelly, and later Ed Zigo materialized briefly. We summed up the purpose of the visit and painstakingly went through the Moskowitz scenario, and then we knew it. The most important evidence was not yet discovered. Surprisingly, with the exception of Zigo, the detectives were not unreceptive to the sales pitch. You've done your homework, Gardella said. You've caught some things no one else did in the media. There are some unanswered questions about the shooting, we won't deny that, but sometimes, like it or not, those questions are never answered, Kelly added. All we know is that we had probable cause to arrest Berkowitz. Once the arrest went down, the files were out of here. Everything was turned over to the DA. It's his case now. We have nothing more to do with it. Between here and Westchester, there are quite a few unanswered questions, to use your phrase. I said to Gardella, I can't talk about Westchester, he responded. We're here in Brooklyn. We don't know anything about these incidents going on up in Yonkers, and we honestly never heard of John Carr until now. Midigar pulled out a copy of a note Berkowitz wrote at Kings County Hospital, which mentioned John Carr. That's John Wheaties, he pointed out. He's real, not just as an alias. Zigo leaned forward, looked at the note, and grudgingly said, That's Berkowitz's handwriting, all right. Where'd you get this? Jim brushed off the question, and Zigo, evidently bored with the discussion, soon left the room. But Kelly and Gardella remained attentive. I think you brought up some interesting things here, Gardella remarked. We want you to see the DA. I looked at Kelly, who nodded in agreement. Gold? Jim inquired. No, Shelley Greenberg. He's the chief assistant, and he's coordinating the case for Gold. I don't know if we'd get anywhere, I said. It was more a question than a statement. We think you should see them, Kelly responded. We call over there and tell them you're coming in about an hour. Midigar readily consented, but I had reservations. I want to hear Jim's impressions of this conference before committing to another, and asked the detectives to tell Gold's office that we'd call for an appointment in a few days. On the way back, we rehashed the morning's events and agreed to carry the information to the DA. I think we touched a nerve, Jim said. I wonder if we just might be running interference for a few people with integrity at the 10th. Maybe. They weren't just patronizing us. You were right to set this up. We're right into the damn lion's den now. Midigar had been urging us Midigar had been urging just such a strategy and had accused me of undue caution. He was right to an extent. I was acutely conscious of the mountain we were trying to move and wanted to be secure with our facts as possible before presenting them to the authorities. We weren't espousing a popular cause. We were going against the established grain. One slip, one error, and our budding credibility would be eagerly destroyed. We couldn't afford to let that happen. I then told Jim about a Christmas Day conversation I had with my cousin Mary Ellen, whom I hadn't seen for several months. In describing that we were working on, I mentioned John Carr and said I knew very little about him. Mary Ellen chided my faulty memory. You know John Carr. He was in our freshman class in high school. Are you serious? He was in another homeroom, she explained. He was thin, had light sandy colored hair, and he was always cutting up. This was high school, and yet he was always throwing spitballs around and doing other antics that were more like a kid in grammar school would do, but he obviously thought it was all funny. As Mary Ellen spoke, I was starting to remember John Carr. What else do you recall? Not much. He wore a red blazer a lot, and I can remember that he wanted to join the Piper's Band. With the mention of the Piper's Band, my mind switched to the Borelli letter. The sentence, "Ugh, me hoot it hurts, sonny boy," was written with a Scottish inflection and was a puzzle to the police were unable to solve. They couldn't explain how Berkowitz allegedly, the letter's author, had come up with a Scottish phrase, or, more importantly, why he did. However, John Carr was interested in playing in a bagpipe band, complete with kilts, while a high school freshman in Yonkers. Did he actually join it, I asked. I don't know if he did or not, but he liked the whole idea, and he may have tried out or gone to one of their meetings. Do you remember him now? I think so. When I pulled out an old yearbook later, I put the name and face to get at once. I put the name and face together at once. I had indeed known John Carr for 1 year, but I hadn't seen or thought of him since we were freshmen 16 years before. My memories were vague. He was just someone I would occasionally spend time with between classes or during lunch breaks. We didn't socialize after hours, and Carr transferred to Gorton High the next year. Our paths hadn't crossed again until now. I also recalled that he attended Holy Rosary Grammar School in Yonkers, and despite the puerile conduct my cousin spoke of, was an intelligent person. Catholic schools, I thought, remembering the police believe that the writer of the Borelli letter had received a Catholic education. The yearbook picture was too old to be of much use. Carr was only 14 when it was taken. Nonetheless, his hair color, eyes, and cheekbones approximated those in the Son of Sam sketch released after the Lomino de Massey woundings. At least the photo didn't rule him out. Little pieces were slowly coming together. When I related the Carr story to Midigar, I did so sheepishly, saying that I would have remembered him. Why? Midigar asked. A kid you knew casually 16 years ago? You didn't even hang out with him after school. Screw it. We've got the information now, and that's more than we had before. We're starting to get a feel for this guy. We're also starting to get the handle on another early suspect, and the source of the information was former football star Kyle Rote. Rote was a collegiate, All-American, and Hall of Fame gridiron standout from Southern Methodist University, who later started with the great New York Giants team of the 50s and early 60s. After retiring, he was a Giants assistant coach for 2 seasons before branching out into broadcasting, working at WNEW radio and WNBC TV in New York City. He was also a color commentator on NFL games broadcast nationally by NBC. We met in 1972 and became close friends over the succeeding years. In November 1977, I was having dinner with him and his wife, Nina, in their Manhattan apartment. While talking about Son of Sam, the Roats recalled an incident that happened in September, just a month after Berkowitz's arrest. At a business dinner, they were introduced to a salesman from Westchester who, as the night passed, inexplicably engaged Nina in a discussion of mysticism and black magic. He then lowered his voice and said Son of Sam was in a satanic cult in Yonkers and they helped him commit the murders, she explained. I didn't believe him, so I asked him how he knew about it, and he said he was acquainted with some people who were connected to it. The relevance of this statement by the salesman, whom I will call Roger Flood, is that the assertion was made only weeks after the Berkowitz apprehension, when the public was universally satisfied that Berkowitz was a lone killer. It was long before any reference to a satanic cult was made. Flood also claimed that the group operated in Yonkers. It would turn out that this statement was accurate too. Flood would be questioned in the future by investigators for the Queens District Attorney's Office, who tracked him down on the West Coast, and while he admitted that the meeting with the Roats account, he denied any knowledge of the cult. Since Flood was in California, the authorities were left with limited legal means, through which to pursue his purported links any further. He either made an extremely accurate guess, or he was in fact aware of the cult's activities. At this time, the answer remains unknown. I had just completed compiling some preliminary data on Flood's job history when I received an unexpected phone call on the night of January 3rd. Bill Gardella wanted to know if we'd contacted the Brooklyn DA's office yet, which we hadn't. We talked to them, and they're expecting you, the detective sergeant explained. If you don't call, we're going to make the appointment for you. Gardella was being friendly, but it was apparent he was also serious. I was reasonably certain he and presumably Kelly thought we might be on to something, but I also believed he couldn't come out and say so. I decided the phone call spoke for itself and simply thanked him for his interest. I'm just doing my job, Gardella said. You came in with information that we think should get into the right hands. He gave me Sheldon Shelley's Greenberg's extension and said he would learn of the meeting's outcome from the prosecutors. On January 5th, Midigar and I convened with Greenberg, the chief assistant district attorney, and Ron Elio, head of the Homicide Bureau, in Greenberg's office in the court complex in Brooklyn. Greenberg was a large, assertive man of 41. Elio, who was younger and more amiable than Greenberg, who opened the 90-minute meeting by reminding us that a court-imposed gag order which prevented principals from speaking publicly about the case was now in effect. While the edict applied to comments to the press, we weren't there in that capacity. I thought Greenberg was hiding behind the order and said so, but he insisted his hands were tied. Think of me as a big sponge. I'm here to absorb information, so let me soak up what you've got, he pronounced grandly. Jim and I looked at each other. And just what do we get in return? Midigar asked. Nothing. I can't say or release a thing. For a moment we were sorely tempted to say sayonara to the sponge, but we opted to stay, hopefully that in the course of the meeting someone would slip out anyway. We told the prosecutors about John Carr, the Moskowitz scene, the occult references, the dead dogs, the Roger Flood statement about the cult. Both men asked numerous questions. When Elio saw that Eliphas Levi occult symbol and compared it with Son of Sam's, he whistled. I'll bet this knocked your socks off when you found it. At another point, Greenberg stated, I once talked to a girl who knew John Carr. The hints were dropping, but he wanted more, and we pressed hard to get it. Greenberg kept walking the tightrope. Finally, he blurted, "Don't you think I'm not pissing in my pants wanting to talk to you? I want to talk to you, but I can't. So if you don't stop pushing, we'll call this off right now." "We're not here to fight, Shelley," I said. "We're supposed to be on the same side. Look, here's where I stand. When we'd like to copy your material, and we want to listen to the rest of your ideas. More than that, I can't do it. If you don't like it, you can leave. Otherwise, we'll continue," Greenberg stated. After nearly 5 months of work, Greenberg's position was infuriating to us. Elio attempted to mediate, but he was unsuccessful. After some more bickering, I was clutching at straws. "Would you at least tell us if you know where John Carr is? Just if you know, so we can stop looking if you do?" The bulky prosecutor rested his head on his hands. "For all I know, he's on the moon. Does that answer your question?" "Shit," Midigar muttered. "No, wait," I interjected. It must be the question at that. It might answer the question at that. You don't know where he is, do you?" No comment. "Look, Shelley," I went on, "your time is valuable and so is ours. Believe it or not, we've put a lot of hours on this, and we came forward to you people. We haven't tried to exploit what we've found. All we want to know, without any details, is if there might be some value in all of this. Just tell us if we're wasting our time and money pursuing this." I was trying for any left-handed confirmation I could get. "Word games," Midigar spat. "Everybody in this room is playing games. It's a bunch of garbage. We're out there trying to get the truth, and you guys sit there like you're anointed. You represent the people. Well, we're the people too." Greenberg shifted in his chair, pushing his glasses to the tip of his nose, and glared at Midigar. "I will respond to your associate's questions by saying that if good citizens feel they have reasons to continue to check on certain things, we're here to listen." "That's listen, not share. Listen," Midigar groaned. "That's noble of you, Shelley," I said, "but I would be reading something incorrectly if I took your statement to mean we're not wasting our time." No comment. "Let me read this gag order to you just in case you haven't heard about it." Our frustration level had peaked. Fortunately, Elio chose that moment to take our typewritten material to a secretary for copying. 5 minutes later, as we walked to the car, I exploded. "Those bastards! They danced around the whole time. They took our information, and we have zero except for some hints that we're moving in the right direction. They're just trying to cover their tails." I thought Elio was willing to be reasonable, but Greenberg was the ringmaster in that circus. "Now you're the one who's mad," Jim answered. "You kept the lid on pretty good in there. It wasn't easy." "Well, it wasn't so bad, at least not a total disaster. They gave us a few things, and they would have laughed us out of there if the case really was a lock. They wouldn't have sat there debating with us. I don't think there even would have been a meeting with those two if they weren't so sure Berkowitz was alone," I offered. "First, Gardella calls me, then we meet with Gold's top people. Not some fifth-level assistant, and they asked a hell of a lot of questions." Jim stopped walking and said, "You know, it's possible, just possible, that they didn't know much at all, and that we know more than they did. Who knows? I did hear some non-direct confirmations, and they didn't give us the 10-minute brush-off, but if anything ever comes out of this, they'll pretend they did it all and we never existed." "No, they won't," Midigar answered. He opened his camera case and pulled out a small tape recorder. "I don't believe this. You taped them? in Greenberg's own office? Only about 2 minutes worth. I wanted to be able to prove we were there, and I wanted John Carr's name on there to prove we warned them about him. Jim turned on the machine, and we heard ourselves discussing the missing John Greenberg's pants wedding comment also was recorded. When I heard that statement, my anger and tension broke, and I began to laugh. I'm sorry, I stammered, but the image of him sitting there blustering away and wetting his pants at the same time is too much for me to deal with. Midigar grinned. That arrogant son of a bitch. Maybe he'd like to hear himself saying that on the 6 o'clock news. In truth, less than 2 minutes of conversation appeared on the tape. If they were up front with us, I'd never have turned it on at all. Jim explained. But once I caught Greenberg's act, I thought they'd take everything and shaft us the first chance they got if the case ever breaks. Two can play their games. Okay, but please, no more of that. Besides not being kosher, it's also risky. For all we know, they were taping us too. At least we're even. At this time, we weren't aware of the confidential police reports and other information available to the DA, or the office's failure to interview its own witnesses, such as Casilia Davis. But with this meeting, the Brooklyn District Attorney was advised of a probable John Carr and Satanic cult link to Berkowitz. The notification was formal and on the record, and soon another police agency would receive the same advisements. I subsequently spoke to Ron Alio twice. Each time, while evasive, he indicated that Midigar and I weren't chasing the wind. And through another contact in Gould's office, I learned several assistants were shown copies of our material, and that John Carr's whereabouts were unknown by Brooklyn prosecution. There would be fallout from our excursion. Inquiries would be made, rippling and heretofore placid pond. In 6 weeks, the swell would reach significant proportions. But first, an incident that grabbed our attention occurred in New York. On Friday, January 6th, the day after the Brooklyn gathering, the bullet-riddled body of Robert Hirschman, 25, was found 100 feet off the Taconic State Parkway in East Fishkill, an hour's drive north of Yonkers. Hirschman, who had a minor theft record, was shot at least 6 times. He worked for a moving company and lived in Queens. The next day, his wife, Maury, 23, was found slain in a vacant lot near Flushing Airport in Queens, about 60 miles from where her husband's body was discovered. Fully clothed, she was slashed and stabbed and strangled, but the couple were married months earlier, then separated for a time. But 3 days before the killing, they checked into a room at the Aqua Motor Inn in Queens, near Aqueduct Racetrack. They were last seen there the day before their deaths. Hirschman's body was adorned with tattoos, one of which was a swastika with words Brother Tom beneath it. Hirschman's first name was Robert, but Brother Tom was consistent with a process, ranking, and name change practice. The double homicide wasn't the first outburst of violence I noted since the arrest of Berkowitz. In October, Susie Rodriguez, 22, who had a shoplifting record in Yonkers, was shot in the head 3 times at point-blank range as she stood on a sidewalk in Elmsford, New York, a Westchester village several miles north of Yonkers. Curiously, Rodriguez, who may have been thrown from an auto before being shot, was found dead on a lawn next door to the home of Elmsford police chief, who heard the shots and saw a light-colored car speed away. Rodriguez was wearing an occult coiled snake ring and another ring police euphemistically described as being popular with gypsies. 6 years later, in the northern New Jersey town of Mountain Lakes, another coiled snake ring victim would be found stabbed to death. The young woman, who was unidentified, also wore a satanic pentagram type of ring, which had a crescent moon mounted beneath the star-shaped pentagram. The woman was killed just days before Lammas Day, a major satanic holiday, and she was the fourth woman slain in that area during an 8-month period. On November 22, 1977, a rifle-toting sniper gunned down 13-year-old Natalie Gallus as she stood in her ground-floor apartment in New Rochelle. A family friend, Susan Levy, 38, was seriously wounded at 10:40 p.m. In the 10:40 p.m. attack. A full-sized dark green car with white vinyl roof was seen racing from the site. Not released by police, and perhaps not even known by them at the time, is the fact that 6 months earlier, during the height of the Son of Sam spree, a full-sized dark green car with a white vinyl roof was also observed at another bizarre sniper's incident in Westchester County. That victim was also a teenage girl, and she also was shot with a rifle through a ground floor window. But unlike Natalie Gallus, Lisa Gottlieb survived. Gottlieb, the poisoner-in-chief? Lisa, 16, lived in Greenburgh, a township in central Westchester about 15 miles from New Rochelle. One warm night in late May 1977, she was dropped off at her house at 1 a.m. by several friends. The teenagers noticed an unfamiliar, full-sized, dark green, white-topped auto parked near Lisa's home. Moments after she entered her residence, a rifle shot fired through a ground floor window wounded her. Because of the similar green cars, the other common circumstances and unusual, apparently motiveless nature of both crimes, which remain unsolved, they were noted by me as I looked for something resembling a cult pattern. Their potential importance was raised appreciably 3 years later when I learned of the satanic cult letter Berkowitz had left behind in his apartment. The wording warned of random attacks on at least 100 young women and men in the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. What sparked my initial interest in these ground floor sniper attacks was another series of similar assaults which took place in the same general time frame with a dart gun. The assailant was known as the infamous Westchester Dartman, a depiction of death in the Middle Ages, and before he or they disappeared, 23 women, almost all of whom lived in ground floor residences, were wounded by inch-long steel darts fired into their heads, necks, and chests from a dart gun. The dartmen prowled at night, selecting ground floor victims and shooting into their homes in several communities in Westchester, including Yonkers and Rockland County, which lies across the Hudson River from central and northern Westchester. The Dartman attacks preceded Son of Sam and overlapped other bizarre Westchester events commencing on February 28, 1975. In Yonkers and ceasing May 13, 1976, in the Rockland community of Nanuet. It was a strange time indeed for Westchester County. Strange, not strange. This is incredible, Midigar exclaimed as I briefed him on the county's recent crime history. All of this completely off-the-wall stuff going on at the same time. Fred Cowan shooting up New Rochelle, Son of Sam, dead German shepherds here and 85 more an hour away, sniper killings and woundings, a girl with an occult ring blown away in front of a police chief's house, and a goddamned Dartman from out of the 15th century or somewhere. Oh, and let's not forget the Westchester child rapist, I added. Between April and November of 76, there were about 14 attacks on young girls between the ages of about 10 and 18. Most were under 15. They got somebody on that. Did he do all of them? It's still in the courts. You know how it goes. Whether he did or didn't, they'll try to wipe the books clean. What is unusual is that this guy supposedly was driving about 5 different makes of cars, so maybe he didn't do all of them, Midigar said. And John Wheaties was called a rapist of young girls. I hear you, but all this wacko stuff going on at once does tend to be curious. You think? And these are just some things we know about. Who knows what we might have missed? None of this has ever happened before. Midigar was incredulous. A dartman who wounds 23 women? This is like the Twilight Zone around here. How many murders occur each year in Westchester? About 20 or 25, no more than that. This is a peaceful suburbia. Well, it looks like somebody decided to start a war, Midigar observed. Some of these things would seem likely they'd almost have to be connected, especially if the crime rate is unusually steady and the types of crimes aren't as unique as these are. I would tend to agree with you. Unfortunately, we have no proof yet. Does Dunleavy know about all this? Jim asked. Not in this context, except for Fred Cowan and the ships. Steve Dunleavy, in fact, was preoccupied with a phantom telephone caller who was regularly regaling him with lurid tales of a satanic cult to which she insisted Berkowitz belonged. The woman, who contacted Dunleavy several times, had the Post's flamboyant columnist convinced she was at least sincere. She's driving me batty, mates. I don't know if she's crazy or not, but she's naming names I haven't been able to get anywhere with. Do you think you can find her or any of these people? But she's never given her name. How are we supposed to find out whom she is? Midigar complained. The world goes beyond this city room. Steve, there are millions of people out there, but it would make sense if we could locate her before going off on what could be a fool's errand as far as these other conspirators go, I said. It's funny, though. There's not a word about Westchester in here. The story merits repeating because its future implications would be considerable. Briefly, the mystery lady charged that Berkowitz belonged to a devil cult operating in Queens and Staten Island. She claimed that a station wagon belonging to a girl named Jane was used in the Moskowitz murder and then abandoned in a pile of rushes adjacent to Little Neck Bay off the Cross Island Parkway in Queens. Jane had then been chopped up and dumped into the bay. She named a former NYPD detective as one of the cult's dope suppliers, and she said he could be found by surveilling the Blue Dolphin Diner in Queens. More murders were planned. The cult's leader was said to be an accountant and former drug user, whom I will call Reeve Carl Rockman. Rockman maintained 2 addresses, one which was very proximate to the Son of Sam Killing's ground in Forest Hills. A major cult safe house, complete with black mass ceremonies, was said to be located at an address on Van Duzer Street in Staten Island. The information was so detailed and specific that Dunleavy was right intrigued by it. With a copy of the woman's latest letter in hand, I met George Austin after work at the Gambelli's restaurant in White Plains on January 25th, a Wednesday night. After reading the note, he asked, "What are you going to do about all this?" She talks about a mutilation murder 3 years ago and says they used a hairbrush on the girl and Berkowitz witnessed it. That's just the thing, George. That crime did happen. We checked it out today, and the hairbrush part was never made public. So she knows? She sure as hell knows something. Jim lives on Staten Island, and he's sniffing around that Van Duzer house tonight. He'll get plate numbers, but no one's going near that front door. Who knows what the hell's going on in there? And you have no idea who wrote the letter? Not a hint, she told Dunleavy on the phone that she knew people in the group and was getting out of town in fear for her life. What about the police? No way. They don't want to hear about any conspiracy, and if we turned it over to the Brooklyn DA, we'd never know what happened. We're staying on our own from now on. Why not the Queens DA, Santucci, or Merola in the Bronx? For what? It's all a big runaround. Everyone we've seen so far is stonewalling. It's horseshit trying to get to the bottom of all this and seeing the public prosecutors covering their butts. Midigar's right. He says the truth doesn't count. It's politics and perception that's important. The system doesn't take care of its own. All this work we're doing is outside the system's appraisal of the case. My evaluation was based on more than our Brooklyn experience. I had made one additional pilgrimage, and it would soon prove to be a consequential journey. Not all convinced that Brooklyn would follow up on the local Yonkers activity we suspected, I spent more than an hour with Sal DeIrio, the Westchester Sheriff's Department's chief of criminal investigators, to inform him about the satanic cult connections we've uncovered concerning Berkowitz, John Carr, and the dead German shepherds. I explained to DeIrio that despite contrary statements by the Carrs and the NYPD, we strongly suspected that Berkowitz and John Carr, at least, were acquainted, and that both may well have belonged to a Westchester-based satanic cult. John Carr, I told DeIrio, was our top suspect. I gave DeIrio a copy of the material we'd earlier provided to Brooklyn and explained that while I knew the 44 homicides weren't in his jurisdiction, any regionalized cult activities or crimes were in his domain. It was hoped that both investigatory ends could meet in the middle. I also discussed another topic with DeIrio. It concerned his department's investigation of the 4 threatening letters Berkowitz anonymously sent to volunteer sheriff's deputy Craig Glassman. I was very interested in confirming that a certain return address, that of Berkowitz's former New Rochelle landlord, appeared on one of those envelopes. DeIrio avoided that issue. The meeting transpired in mid-January, shortly before Jim and I received that Dunleavy letter. When I left DeIrio's office in Valhalla, I didn't know that he would soon begin a quiet investigation, which meant, strictly speaking, that the 44 case was reopened, then on at least a limited local basis. Among other things, the department would begin to make inquiries about John Carr. DeIrio, whom I contacted occasionally thereafter, never revealed that John Carr probe had begun. I later learned why. DeIrio would attempt to wash his hands of any culpability, but he would become perhaps unwillingly a player in the game of cover-up which was about to begin. Technically, he would claim non-involvement on jurisdictional grounds, but one will be able to judge the extent of his responsibility with the cloak of territorial innocence removed. In fairness to DeIrio, it's possible he protected his standing in his department's hierarchy by adhering to Son of Sam marching orders dictated by the man who was then his boss, Sheriff Thompson Delaney. Delaney was a former captain in the New York City Police Department. The NYPD was engaged in an all-out battle to protect its soul killer interests in the 44 case, and Delaney's ties there were numerous. We didn't know it, but the clock had now begun to wind down on Mr. John Wheatley's car. We had set in motion ourselves. Standing on the bar in Gambelli's, George and I continued rehashing the frightening Dunleavy letter as the night wore on. At about 8 p.m., an acquaintance named Jim Duffy took over our side of the serving area at the bartenders changed shifts. Duffy, two, Duffy, 32, wore glasses and sported curly brown hair and a friendly demeanor. He knew of my involvement with the Sam case and asked me how the conspiracy hunt was going. Tell him about the letter, George suggested. Yeah, this is the latest entry in the sweepstakes. Some unknown woman is calling Steve Dunleavy and sending him letters about this satanic cult. It's eerie stuff, to put it mildly. What's she saying? Duffy asked. Blood, gore, murder, and mayhem. She names a couple of people and says there's some supposed cult house out on Staten Island. Staten Island? Yeah, my partner lives out there and he's checking on it now. Where on Staten Island? Duffy wanted to know. I used to go to college there at Wagner. Well, I don't know Staten Island, but this addressed on Van Duzer Street. Duffy's eyes widened like globes. Where on Van Duzer? I used to live on Van Duzer. It's a small residential street. Really? Then maybe you'd know where this is. It's number 583. Duffy dropped the bar towel. That's the house I rented a room in. Duffy George opened his coat like a cop flashing a badge. You're under arrest. Search this man for dog biscuits. I was laughing. Great collar. Put him on the chain gang. Yes, as soon as we shepherd him out of here. Hey, you shitheads. I really did live at 583 Van Duzer Street, Duffy insisted. We weren't buying the story at all. There were millions of addresses in the New York area, and it was statistically impossible that the second person I'd tell about 583 Van Duzer would have lived there at one time. Moreover, it was at least 40 miles from White Plains, but Duffy remained adamant. After another 5 minutes of deriding him, I decided to put an end to his joke. You claim to have lived there 9 or 10 years ago when you were in college. Who owned the house then? The Mehans. First name? Jack, actually. John Meehan. I went to the payphone and dialed information to learn if a John Meehan still resided at 583 Van Duzer on Staten Island. In a minute, I was back at the bar. I gave Duffy a quizzical look. You'll be interested in knowing that they're still there. George was startled. Jesus Christ. It's for real? It's for real? Could your old landlord be running a cult house, Duffy? Duffy was suddenly as mystified as we were. In the right-wrong debate about the address itself, he'd forgotten why the subject was broached in the first place. No way. They're a nice family. They couldn't be involved in any of this deranged stuff. The letter says they are. Maybe something snapped out there since you lived in that house, or maybe they've got some borders into this thing and the Mehans don't even know about it, I suggested. We were all still shaken by the incalculable coincidence. Hell, after tonight, anything's possible, I guess, Duffy replied, but I still can't believe the Mehans. I can't believe any of this is happening. It was time for a plan. Without Duffy, we could be staking out the house for months. We needed to get inside, and Duffy could provide a way in through the front door. I asked the stunned bartender if he'd accompanied us to Staten Island the next night and told him Midigar, who had police experience, would come along. You know them, I explained. We'll all knock at the door. You can say you were trying to visit Jim and me and stopped by to say hello for old time's sake. Well, we'll play it by ear from there. I don't know. That letter sounded pretty specific. If it's accurate, it could be dangerous out there. Come on, I said lightly. The Mehans know who you are. They're not going to butcher you in the basement. Even killers take a night off now and then. I was smiling, but I didn't feel any mirth. The potential for danger did exist. Duffy thought for a long moment. Okay, I'll do it. This might be something to tell my grandchildren someday. The next night, after convincing Midigar that he too wasn't being set up for some diabolical joke, we knocked on the door of 583 Van Duzer, a quaint wooden house on a narrow street. Before approaching, we took down plate numbers of all nearby cars and looked around the back of the house. The Mehans, to our relief, seemed like a pleasant middle-aged couple, but we wanted to meet their children, and then there was the matter of any boarders in the house. Boarders. Boarders. As the Mehans and Duffy talked over old times, Midigar and I, trying to appear unconcerned, took in as much of the surroundings and the Mehans as we could. At one point their son arrived, and we eyed him cautiously. Finally, after a prearranged signal, Duffy timidly mentioned that Jim and I were reporters who wanted to discuss something with them. I grimaced. Duffy was supposed to ask the first tentative question so as not to alert or alarm the couple, but he tossed the ball to us instead. Fortunately, Jim was ready for it. Have you had any kind of trouble recently with anyone in the neighborhood? It was a safe, non-threatening question, and if it struck the right nerve, a floodgate could open. Now that's something out of the blue. How did you know about that? We'd rather hear it from you, Mr. Meehan, if you don't mind, I responded. Meehan and his wife, at ease because Duffy was with us, said that a strange woman who wore long robes had lived in the neighborhood until several months previous. The woman, they said, would stare at the house all the time and stop their son and say, I know who you are and what you're involved with. Don't think you're going to get away with it. When did this start? I asked. Last summer. She wasn't really threatening to us. She was just very strange, Mrs. Meehan answered. I then threw out the name of another Staten Island resident from a different neighborhood whom Dunleavy's caller accused of being a cult member. Do you know a Mike Wallem? Yes, of course we do. He's a good friend of ours. Does he come to this house? Jim asked. Yes. Another series of questions to both the Mehans and their son to satisfy ourselves they were being truthful. We knew right where we stood. Do you perhaps know the same? Do you happen to know the name of this strange woman and where she lived? Jim inquired. No, Mrs. Meehan replied. We don't know her name, but she lived down the street. An elderly woman named Erna owns a two-family house. This woman, her husband, and I think a black girl lived on the other floor. They rented from Erna, who is a sweet, harmless old lady. I don't think she'd know anything. Would you show us the house and introduce us? Jim questioned. Sure, Jack would take you down there. Jim and I had been circumspect about our reason for talking to the Mehans, but after we left their house, Jack Meehan asked, So what's all this about, fellows? Is the woman in trouble? It wasn't her, Mr. Meehan. It was you, I replied. You're supposed to be David Berkowitz's accomplice. You're supposed to be David Berkowitz's accomplices and hold black masses in your basement. Meehan, flabbergasted, stopped dead in his tracks after we summarized the allegations. He was enraged at the letter-writing strange woman. She would be thrown in jail, he stormed, and telling this to the newspapers? God knows who else she slandered us to. We're not sure it's her yet, I said, but you just found out about this tonight. She's been haunting Dunleavy for months. That should make you feel at least a little better. I'm afraid it doesn't, Meehan said. It would if you knew Dunleavy, Jim deadpanned, but Meehan just gave him a blank stare. Don't worry, Jim added quickly. We're upset about this too. We're not sure yet it's this woman, but we're going to try to find out. Erna Wagner was a frail, white-haired woman well into her 80s. She was infirm, hard of hearing, and couldn't understand much of what we were saying. Her home was filled with statues of various saints and the Blessed Virgin. She kept no records and couldn't remember the name of her former tenant. We were about to give up when I asked if she'd ever heard from the lady again. The spark of recognition lit the old woman's eyes, and she hobbled to a bureau and produced a letter. On the envelope was a name and return address on Bayside, Queens. The enclosed message was rife with crosses and symbols and mentioned the Meehans, son of Sam bodies, and Little Neck Bay and black masses on Van Duzer Street. The writer claimed she was on a secret mission for the police. Hush, Erna. You must not tell anyone, the letter warned. We got her, I exclaimed, and she's got this poor old woman caught up in this dreadful stuff. I looked at Erna. Are you okay? Does any of this frighten you? I asked, indicating the letter. Erna shrugged her sloped shoulders. I don't see well, she whispered. You mean you weren't able to read this? Only a little, but she told me about bad people. And how do you feel about that? Jim almost shouted. Erna gestured toward her myriad statues. I pray. We asked Erna if we could take the letter and envelope with us, and she handed them to Jim. As gently as possible, we told her that there was nothing to fear in the neighborhood, and Jack Meehan came in and assured her he'd stop by frequently to see how she was getting along. And then we left Erna Wagner alone and feeble as we found her, but perhaps with a sense of security she hadn't felt in months. Verona Lucan? Are you guys sure? Steve Dunleavy was shocked that we'd solved his 5 months mystery in 2 days. How the hell did you come up with this? This is great work, mates. It's good detective work, Steve. How'd you ever figure out it was her? That's a long story, Jim said. He and I decided to refrain from telling Dunleavy about the 10 million to 1 shot involving Duffy. After we found it was her, we went looking for this Jane Jacqueline, who was supposed to be fish food in Little Neck Bay, I continued. It turns out Jane is still alive. We found her too. She told us the cops practically broke down her door a few months ago because someone called to tell them a murder was taking place. Then we went to Lucan's house in Bayside, Midigar explained. Her husband let us in. He seemed okay, like he didn't know what was going on. Their number is unlisted, but I asked to use the phone and copied it off the dial. She was in the house, but wouldn't come out of the bedroom. The chicken shit bitch. Dunleavy was astonished. What about the cult and the Reeve Carl Rockman, who's the leader? If there's a cult, she knows about it. It's not in that house on Staten Island, I said. We checked out Rockman. He does exist with 2 addresses under 2 different names, which is interesting. In one listing, he's Reeve C. Rockman, and in the other, he's Reeve T. Carl. But what does it all mean? This whole thing is Lucan's hallucination. That's right, Jim said. She had a chance to explain when we went to her house, but she dove under the bed. Dunleavy was shaking his head in disbelief. Hey, Steve, Jim said. The letter did sound legit. It had a lot of detail and specifics. It had all of us going, but it's bullshit. Christ. But you guys didn't talk to her. She was driving me crazy with these phone calls and this sinister plot. She sounded believable. She really did. To her, it probably seems real, I added. That's why she was so convincing. I'd love for us to write something about all this, but it would only hurt the investigation. But can you see the headline? Famous seer of Bayside exposed? In a real way, Veronica Lucan was, in fact, famous. Since 1970, the heavy-set middle-aged housewife and mother had been known to countless New Yorkers and others in the United States and Canada as the woman who periodically packed the former World's Fair grounds in Queens with devout believers who listened to the Virgin Mary and Christ speak through the mouth of Veronica Lucan. Lucan's legions numbered in the many thousands. Busloads of faithful would depart for hallowed Queens from points throughout the country. When they received the word that Mary or her son was about to enlighten them with a new series of messages transmitted through Lucan's trance-like meditations, which took place in full view of the hordes of pilgrims, one cannot help but wonder how the multitudes would have just responded had they known that this living embodiment of Mary and Jesus was filling her idle hours with scurrilous accusations. Lucan Society, which did not discourage contributions from believers, issued a variety of literature, including a newspaper called Michael Fighting, which was named for the Archangel Michael. The publications fervently reported the sacred word as spoken by Veronica, who foretold of World War III, the end of civilization, earthquakes, flood, and other natural disasters, unless humankind reversed its evil course. During these public pronouncements, thousands of ears heard and thousands of eyes read the Blessed Mother's kind words for Veronica herself. This phenomenon would occasionally spawn another minor miracle, the simultaneous opening of hundreds of wallets and purses. Veronica, Mary, Jesus frequently bemoaned the dangers of temptation in the modern world, and did so by reminding her disciples that Satan was very much about in the 20th century. The evil serpent who lost a heavenly battle to the Archangel Michael was seeking an earthly inroad via infiltration of the media, the entertainment business, and certainly world government. Veronica's visions, which she vividly described to the throngs of believers as they were occurring, would invariably involve great flashes of light in the sky, which only Veronica could see before the Virgin of Christ appeared. Frequently, the Blessed Mother would shed tears as she recounted through Veronica the dark times to come unless mankind chose the path of salvation. The communists in Russia were also routinely discussed on the heavenly hotline. Lucan was shielded from her disciples during her visionary sessions by a carefully chosen honor guard of white beretted followers. She counts among her membership a number of police and fire officials. Not surprisingly, Lucan's preaching had been viewed with a measure of disdain by the Archdiocese of New York, and she and her followers have caused headaches for the NYPD and other law enforcement agencies over matters such as crowd control, freedom of assembly, trespassing permits, and the like. Scuffles have been reported occasionally as her followers surged against the white beret platoons of bodyguards, and now Veronica had been feeding us vile information anonymously. She had thought about the Son of Sam case. Dunleavy, Midigar, and I consigned her allegations to a circular file in early February 1978. Little did we know she would surface again. The determination that the Lucan allegations were false had taken but a few days, but its depressing effect lingered. The anticipation that a break might have been in the offing was high. The ensuing crash discouraging. With his shining star, Lucan burned out in a flash of futility. Dunleavy became temporarily moribund. There also was no word from Brooklyn or the sheriff's department in Westchester, and we were now of the belief none would be forthcoming. John Carr, our chief suspect, was still among the missing, and prosecution efforts to convict Berkowitz as the lone killer were grinding through the judicial system. Essentially, we were nearly out of options. We'd made this attempt, but were now on the brink of failure. On the 18th of February, a blizzard buried New York and my downstairs neighbors through an open-air fish dry in defiance of Mother Nature. On the 9th, I ventured through the snow to see Saturday Night Fever, whose Brooklyn disco-eth setting reminded me of the previous summer's 44 shootings. Given my state of mind, I could have done without the flashback. I saw the film with a new acquaintance, a pretty physical therapist from Mamaroneck, whom I was seeing socially because my wife and I had separated a few months before. We made a sincere effort, but the mutual magic had eroded. We did, however, remain friendly. On Saturday, February 11th, I cut through the remaining snow drifts and drove by the car home in Yonkers for the first time in more than 2 weeks. In a large driveway, I vacantly noted the usual assortment of autos, most of which belonged to operators who worked for Carr's telephone answering service. There was one vehicle I hadn't seen there before, a blue 1971 Mercury. Unlike the others, it was still covered with snow, to the extent that I couldn't read its license plate. I was about to drive on when I started to think about that snow, which suggested that Carr hadn't been moved for at least several days. Looking around the street, I saw no one. It was dusk. It was cold, and most people were indoors. I took a small pad and pen from my glove compartment, pulled over, and cautiously ventured up the driveway. Quickly, I knelt out of sight of the house and scraped the snow from the rear license plate. It was North Dakota plate number 462653. I had finally found John Wheaty's car. And that's it for today.